You're standing in a grocery store. Fluorescent light overhead. A cart half full. A Tuesday like any other Tuesday. You reach for something. Your hand pauses just for a second out of habit. And then, for the first time in your entire life, you don't look at the price. You simply put it in the cart. Nothing around you changes. Nobody notices. No music starts playing. No stranger walks up to congratulate you. The cashier scans it exactly the way she scans everything else. The world continues on, completely indifferent to what just happened. But something inside your brain quietly changes forever. That was the day money stopped controlling every decision you made. That's the day the story actually begins. Not with an investment. Not with a number in an account. With a hand that didn't stop moving toward the shelf. Almost everyone checks prices. Not because they're careful and not because they're cheap. Because somewhere along the way, their brain learned that checking prices was necessary for survival. Think back to childhood if you can. A parent standing in an aisle very much like this one, doing quiet math in their head. Comparing two brands of the same product, holding one in each hand, weighing cents against cents. A calculator pulled out at the register just to be sure. A phrase repeated so often it stopped sounding like a question and started sounding like a rule. Can we afford this? Nobody sits a child down and teaches this deliberately. It's absorbed the way accents are absorbed, the way posture is absorbed. You watch it happen enough times, and it becomes part of how you move through the world, long after you've stopped noticing you're doing it at all. Price checking becomes identity, not a habit you chose. A lens you were handed before you were old enough to know there might be other lenses available. And here's the part that surprises people. This doesn't disappear just because income rises. Plenty of people who earn far more than they once did still feel that same small flinch at the register. Still glance at the total before it's even finished ringing up. Still hunt for a coupon out of instinct rather than necessity. The number in their bank account changed. The wiring underneath the habit didn't. This isn't about mathematics. It was never about mathematics. It's about psychology, laid down early, running quietly in the background for decades. Now, here's something worth separating clearly, because the two get confused constantly. Checking prices isn't the problem. Being forced to check is. There's an enormous difference between a person who glances at a price out of curiosity, out of habit, out of simple interest in value, and a person who glances at a price because their entire nervous system depends on the answer. Think about how many moments in an ordinary week carry this quiet weight. A restaurant menu, scanned not for what sounds good, but for what's affordable, appetite quietly rearranged around a column of numbers. A fuel gauge watched with more anxiety than curiosity, calculating whether the tank can stretch one more day before payday. A vacation, imagined and then unimagined in the same breath, the moment a price appears beside it. Medicine weighed against rent, an impossible arithmetic nobody should ever have to do standing in a pharmacy aisle. A birthday gift for someone you love, chosen not by what would delight them, but by what won't cause a problem later in the month. Every one of these moments creates a small spike of anxiety. Every one costs mental energy, spent quietly, invisibly, dozens of times a week, adding up to something far heavier than any single decision would suggest on its own. This is the real poverty tax. Not the absence of money exactly, the absence of freedom. The tax isn't paid at the register. It's paid inside your own head. Every single time a purchase requires a calculation before it can become a decision. And this is where most conversations about money stop short. They talk about how to earn more, how to save more, how to invest more. All useful, all incomplete, because none of it addresses the actual weight being carried. That weight isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in how many times a day your brain has to ask permission from your bank account before it's allowed to want something. Picture two people standing in the exact same grocery store, holding the exact same item. One of them feels a small tightening in their chest, a silent negotiation between want and afford. The other feels nothing at all, simply because the calculation that used to run automatically has nothing left to calculate. Same item, same price, same store. Two completely different internal experiences, invisible to anyone watching from the outside. That difference is what this entire story is actually about. Not the item, not the store, not even the money, really. The gap between the two people standing there is a gap built over years, sometimes decades, out of thousands of small moments that never made headlines and never felt significant enough to remember individually. 100 grocery runs where the total mattered more than the food. 100 restaurant menus scanned right to left, price before dish. None of them dramatic on their own. All of them quietly accumulating into a way of experiencing the world. And most people assume that gap only closes with a windfall. A raise large enough to finally silence the calculation. A bonus, a promotion, some external event that arrives and fixes things from the outside. But that's not actually how it closes for most people who eventually stand where the second person stands. It closes slowly, from somewhere you can't see, built out of years that felt at the time like nothing was happening at all. One day, without any warning, without any ceremony, your investments quietly make more money this month than your grocery bill costs you. Read that again because it deserves a second pass. Not more than your salary. Not more than your rent. More than your grocery bill, one of the smallest, most routine expenses in your entire life. And yet the moment it happens, something enormous has actually occurred, even though almost nothing about your day looks any different. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface. Your income didn't suddenly explode. You didn't receive a promotion or a windfall or a lucky break. Years of invisible work, contributions made when nothing seemed to be happening, simply crossed a line that had been approaching quietly the entire time. You don't even notice at first. That's the strange part nobody prepares you for. There's no notification, no message from a bank congratulating you, no visible marker separating the month before from the month after. You keep living exactly the way you were living, completely unaware that something fundamental just shifted underneath you. Until one ordinary afternoon, you reach for something on a shelf. And your eyes don't look down. This is the scene. This is the entire story, compressed into a single motion of a hand that used to hesitate and now doesn't. Let it sit for a moment. Picture it slowly, frame by frame, the way a film would hold on this exact instant rather than rushing past it. The fluorescent light, the cart, the item in your hand, and the absence of a glance that, for your entire life until now, would have happened automatically, without you even deciding to do it. That absence is the whole story, not a number appearing, a number disappearing from your attention entirely. So what actually changed? Because your paycheck looks roughly the same. Your job title didn't change. Nobody handed you anything. Here's where the real shift becomes visible, once you know where to look for it. You didn't earn your way here. You built your way here. There's a difference, and it matters enormously. Earning is something you do every single day, actively, using hours and energy that run out the moment you stop showing up. Building is something you did once, repeatedly in small increments, that kept working long after each individual action was finished and forgotten. Assets replaced decisions. That's the sentence worth writing down. For years, every purchase required a decision, a small negotiation between want and afford, runs silently in your head dozens of times a week. Now, an asset sitting quietly somewhere you rarely think about is producing enough on its own to absorb that decision before it ever has to happen. Money became a worker, not your worker exactly in the sense of something you supervise or manage. More like a colleague who showed up long ago, learned the job, and now simply does it, month after month, without needing instructions or encouragement. And here's the identity shift underneath all of this, the part that actually explains why your hand stopped hesitating at that shelf. Instead of asking, "Can I afford this?" your brain now asks a completely different question. Do I even want this? Those two questions sound similar. They are not similar. One is a financial calculation, run under quiet pressure, weighing a price against a limited resource. The other is a preference, run freely, weighing desire against nothing but itself. The first question keeps you tethered to your bank account every time you reach for something. The second question sets you loose to simply notice what you actually feel. This is a completely different identity, not a slightly improved version of the same one. The person who asks, "Can I afford this?" and the person who asks, "Do I even want this?" are technically standing in the same body, in the same store, holding the same item. But they are experiencing two entirely different lives. Most people assume this shift requires becoming wealthy in some obvious, visible sense. A number large enough to feel like an achievement, a milestone worth announcing. But that's not quite right. What actually changes isn't a lifestyle. It's a mechanism running quietly underneath every decision you make. One that eventually produces enough on its own to absorb the small purchases that used to require thought. Think back to the person standing beside you in that earlier scene, the one who still felt the tightening in their chest. They aren't behind because they're less capable or less intelligent or less deserving. They simply haven't reached the point yet where the mechanism underneath their decisions has grown large enough to absorb what used to require calculation. And here's what makes this moment so quietly powerful. Once you actually sit with it, it doesn't arrive with fireworks because it was never supposed to. It arrives the way most real transformations arrive, disguised as an ordinary afternoon, indistinguishable from every other afternoon that came before it, except for one small, silent detail that only you would ever notice. Your hand reached for something, and this time it simply kept moving. It's worth pausing on why this particular scene carries so much weight. More than a bigger house would. More than a nicer car would. Those things are visible. They announce themselves to anyone watching. This doesn't. Nobody in that grocery store has any idea what just happened inside you. There's no external proof, no symbol, nothing that could be photographed or shown off. It exists entirely as an internal change, a rewiring so quiet it could easily be mistaken for nothing at all. And maybe that's exactly why it matters more than the visible symbols people usually chase. Because it isn't performed for anyone. It isn't even performed for yourself, in the sense of noticing it in real time. It simply happens underneath the surface the same way everything that led to it happened underneath the surface, for years without an audience, without applause, without a single moment of recognition until you're standing in that aisle, reaching for something, and realizing your hand already knew something your mind hadn't caught up to yet. Here's where this story takes a turn almost nobody expects. Because the side effects of reaching this point aren't what you'd assume. You'd think someone free from price anxiety would shop more, buy more, indulge constantly, finally released from years of restraint. The opposite tends to happen. You shop faster. Without the internal calculation running in the background, decisions simply take less time. What used to require comparing 3 options, checking 2 prices, and hesitating over a shelf now takes seconds, because the deciding factor shifted from cost to preference, and preference is a much quicker question to answer. You stop chasing sales. The thrill that used to come from finding something 20% off quietly fades, because the 20% was never really the point. It was relief, disguised as excitement, relief from a calculation that no longer needs to run. Discount emails become irrelevant. Inboxes that used to matter, scanned eagerly every week for the next opportunity to save, simply stop getting opened. Not out of superiority, out of genuine disinterest, the same way a person who's already eaten stops noticing a menu. Black Friday feels boring. An entire day built around urgency and scarcity loses its grip entirely, because urgency only works on a nervous system still calculating whether it can afford to wait. And impulse buying, strangely, drops. This is the part that surprises people most, because it seems backward. Shouldn't someone with more freedom buy more impulsively? Not less? But impulse buying was never really about spontaneity. It was an emotional release valve, a reward mechanism for a brain that spent all week restricting itself. Remove the restriction, and the pressure driving the impulse disappears along with it. Ironically, you often end up spending less, because buying stops being emotional. It stops being a coping mechanism, a small rebellion against constant restraint, a momentary escape from constant calculation. It simply becomes a quiet, occasional decision, made from genuine want rather than accumulated pressure. That's an idea worth sitting with because it contradicts almost everything people assume about what wealth changes. It doesn't necessarily change how much you spend. It changes why you spend, and that difference reshapes almost everything downstream of it. Now, here's a twist that reframes everything we've talked about so far. Many wealthy people still look at prices. Not occasionally. Regularly, consistently, sometimes more carefully than people with far less. And at first glance, that seems to contradict this entire story. It doesn't once you understand the distinction. They aren't looking because they need to. They're looking because they respect money, the same way a skilled craftsman respects their tools, not out of fear of losing them, but out of genuine appreciation for what they represent. The poor fear prices. The wealthy compare value. That single distinction changes everything about what looking at a price actually means. Fear narrows your attention down to one question. Can I survive this cost? Comparison opens your attention up to a completely different question. Is this actually worth what's being asked for it? Same action, completely different internal experience, driven by two entirely different relationships with money. Which brings us to the real twist hiding underneath this entire story. The one worth carrying with you long after this video ends. The goal was never ignoring prices completely. That would be arrogance, not freedom, a kind of carelessness that eventually catches up with anyone who practices it long enough. The actual goal is simpler and far more powerful. It's not, I don't care what things cost. It's, I don't have to care. Those two sentences look almost identical on paper. They describe completely different lives. One is indifference. The other is freedom. Indifference ignores information. Freedom simply removes the fear attached to it, leaving the information itself perfectly intact, available whenever you choose to use it, optional rather than mandatory. That's the massive difference this entire story has been building toward. Not a person who stopped noticing prices. A person for whom noticing a price stopped being an emergency. Now, imagine walking into that same grocery store 5 years from today. The shelves haven't changed much. The prices have probably gone up the way prices always do. The cart looks exactly the same as it always has, slightly squeaky wheel and all. But one thing is different. You are. Not because you got lucky. Not because someone handed you something you didn't earn. Because years earlier, quietly, without any single dramatic moment marking the occasion, you built something that kept working while you slept, while you were at your job thinking about completely unrelated things, while you lived an entire ordinary life largely unaware of what was accumulating underneath it. And one ordinary afternoon, without even realizing it was happening, you reached for something on a shelf and never looked at the price. That wasn't the moment you became wealthy. It was the moment you finally realized you already were. And maybe that's the sentence worth ending on, because it reframes everything this story has been quietly pointing toward. Wealth, in the way that actually matters, was never the number on a screen. It was the absence of a flinch. It was a hand that stopped hesitating. It was a question that changed, silently, from can I afford this to do I even want this? Nobody will ever see that moment happen. There's no photograph of it, no announcement, no way to prove it occurred at all, except for the small, permanent shift in how you move through a grocery store that once controlled far more of your life than you ever realized while you were living inside it.